Welcome to Design Downtime, the podcast where we celebrate the joys of living a balanced, creative life. I'm your host, Guy Siegel, a design director in Toronto, Canada, and I invite you to join me on this journey as we redefine what it means to be a successful design professional. Let's break free from the shackles of hustle culture and embrace the full spectrum of human experience, because life is too precious to be spent only in pursuit of productivity. Today, I'm thrilled to talk to Asia Hoe. Asia is a multi-disciplinary, award-winning product design leader with over 15 years of experience in user experience design and strategy, front-end development, and design systems. She has worked with startups, agencies, Fortune 500 companies, and small business owners to develop user-centric experiences in education, healthcare, and finance. She recently joined a team at Jasper to explore the intersection of marketing and AI. Asia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Guy.
It is a pleasure having you. And today you want to talk about video games.
Absolutely.
Tiny, small topic.
Very tiny.
Hopefully we'll have more than 1 minute to talk about. I always love to start with the origin story. Where do video games come into the picture for you?
Yeah, video games come in very, very early into my life. My parents were both gamers, and one of my earliest memories is me just sitting on the bed between the two of them playing, I believe it was Super Mario World 2 or 1. It might be 1 because 3 is my favorite. But I was just watching them, and before long they handed me the controller, and the rest is history. Between Mario and Donkey Kong, my early bases were covered, but we eventually did get a Sega Genesis, so I played Sonic too.
So you're not religious to either Nintendo or Sega?
No, I am very agnostic even today. That has pulled over into how I use my devices for work. I have Android, I have iOS, I have it all. I like to explore different platforms, and I think that really started with games.
Yeah, you said when we were chatting before the recording, you said that you're essentially an omni gamer. You would play anything, everything. What are some of your favorites?
Yeah, so growing up, I really loved platformers. Mario didn't really stick for me until Yoshi's Island, because that's when they started to introduce elements of collecting things and jumping around from level to level. And that really stuck with me, especially since I was already playing things like Donkey Kong and Sonic. And those have always been favorites, moving from the 16-bit era into the 64-bit era. I was playing things like Banjo-Kazooie. The 64-bit versions of Mario became more like collectathons, all the way up until most recently, where in general, I've really enjoyed indie games because a lot of them have stayed closer to the roots of gaming, as opposed to everything kind of feeling like it needs to be the cinematic thing that emulates cinema, which is fun in some respects, but it gets a little old. Whereas there's something about these games that tells unique stories that really holds my attention a lot more than something that's trying to be something that the genre is not.
We'll definitely come back to indie games, but I want to go back to the origin, you playing with your parents. Is that something that continued, or did you sort of found your path with video games?
No, it's definitely something that has continued. It continues to this day, and I get to pass it on to my niece. She plays in a totally different domain. She's stuck on Roblox, but every once in a while we'll get her on the Nintendo Switch. Yeah, I still play with my mom, and at one time I was like the game master. When my parents got stuck in a game, I'd be the one who'd figure it out as new paradigms were introduced, and they weren't quite like figuring it out because they'd been playing since like Pong and all that. And yeah, it's amazing to see how quickly this stuff can change.
Is it something that I know starting in the 80s with those games, and then, you grow with the different consoles, you have new games that are coming in. Do you ever go back and visit those times of early video games?
Absolutely. And actually, this is something that I started doing again since the pandemic. I am fortunate that I still have my Game Boy Color. It actually survived a fire, so it's a little sooty, but it still works. But I actually ended up investing in a device called the Analog Pocket, which allows me to play Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and regular Game Boy games as well. So literally right behind me, there's a box of cartridges. I also have a cartridge reader that lets me copy it, so I don't have to carry the physical cartridge around anymore. Those are a murky area for Nintendo, but I'm like, I have a copy. I think this fits within the fair use. So I've been playing around with that and exploring some games that, frankly, I didn't get to play because I was away at school or I didn't have access to my device at the time the game came out. And then there's a growing indie scene around people releasing new titles for these older platforms. If you can get a hold of either the ROM, which is the digital file, or a hard cartridge in some cases, you can run them on these older devices, which I think is really neat. We also have Sega Dreamcast that we've been recollecting games for. My parents were traders as well, so they'd send things into GameStop, and I'm recollecting some of the favorites that I had back then now that I have adult money to play with. And that's one thing I share with my partner that's been really fun.
You said that Yoshi's Island is the first time that stuck for you. And you talked about the element of collecting. How did that add that longevity to the game for you?
So for better or worse, I'm a perfectionist. I absolutely love to see 100% or more in a game, especially if the gameplay loop is rewarding enough that I can keep coming to it, or it rewards me for going that extra mile. So in the case of Yoshi's Island, there were bonus hidden levels that only unlocked if you had gone through and collected all the coins or managed to get a full set of stars, which would have been 30. Yeah, that for me was really fun to do, especially since some of the games really force you to look at the game as a construct of different patterns and then force you to think outside of those patterns. So for example, Mario was the game that set the precedent of go right to proceed. But in Donkey Kong, one of the first secrets in the first game is you go left and you get a free life. And I love little things like that. Some of those levels really challenged me and it felt like a puzzle, and I really enjoy puzzles. So yeah, absolutely extends the longevity, even if I've already done it and I kind of want to do it again just to see if I could, because I'm finding that the mindset that I had as a child is different now that I'm an adult. And there are some things that I can't figure out now that just for some reason made sense then. It's like, why is this so hard now? And so I really like revisiting that and seeing like where my headspace is. And it also gives me certain ideas for just how things are designed in general.
So that's a really interesting point, and I wanted to sort of visit this a bit more. The difference between you gaming as a child and you gaming as an adult. You said one of the things was that sense of exploration and finding things that you wouldn't think to look for today. What are some other differences between you playing as a child versus you playing now?
Yeah, I think as a child, immersion in the game came really easily because I didn't have any preconceived notions about the game as an experience. It just was. It was fun. I wanted to see what the developers had come up with, and I wanted to experience that. But as an adult, I'm almost both playing it with that mindset, but also have the meta of like, okay, why did they design it this way? What might I have done differently? How does this compare to another game in this genre? I recently started playing a game called Wild Frost, which is like a tactical roguelike builder, which sounds like a lot of mumbo jumbo when I say it out loud, but it's very similar to another title that was really popular called Slay the Spire. And despite being very similar, almost I dare say the same in certain respects, there's a lot of nuance there that I find really compelling. And so I'm looking at it not only as a player, but as a game designer. And while I have taken a stab at like designing my own games, developing my own games at like game jams and things like that, I use it as a funnel into how I think about software design, but also to think about just interactivity in general. Yeah, I really enjoy it's a new meta puzzle for me to like take it apart and almost reverse engineer the game design elements, like what decisions were made, why does this game feel unique, even though the core loop is about the same. Especially a roguelike, you're literally supposed to lose over and over again. So what's so compelling about this that I'll jump right back in? Yeah, I think that meta aspect is new for me, but in a way it also adds to the replayability because I'm not always going to catch that the first time, especially if the game really hooks me and gets me into that immersive environment.
Do you still have that same drive to collect everything, finish a game 100% or more as an adult?
As an adult, as much as I would like to have that drive, there's just not enough time considering the rate at which games are published. And it certainly has slowed down, unfortunately, in the most recent years with countless layoffs and things like that. As a child, I only had access to what my parents was buying. And then after that, whatever my allowance could afford me. And now I'm like, I have Game Pass. At any one time, I have access to at least 50 games. And then there's an entire backlog of games that I haven't even looked at because they were on sale at Steam. But yeah, and then of course, there's the backlog of everything I've ever owned that I've managed to hold on to. So I recently recharged my Nintendo DS because I was like, I really want to get off the computer completely and re-experience like just gaming for gaming's sake with no other like tickers, no achievements. And it's funny, I always come back to Nintendo for that because they deliberately like hone in on that. It's like the game might have achievements inside of it, but it's not something you're competing with someone else for the way it might be on Xbox or PlayStation. It's solely for yourself. And I think that kind of play is really important because at some point, everything became monetized, everything became competitive, and sometimes you just want to shut it all out and just focus on one thing at a time. And I think gaming is a good outlet for that.
So you mentioned indie games already. And one of the things, I mean, of course, the difference between a AAA game, let's say an indie game is, of course, there's different budgets, right? Different levels of sizes of teams working on it. But what else for you makes the difference? What makes an indie game an indie game?
I think another thing that makes me call an indie game is whether it bucks certain trends. Like, for instance, a lot of AAA games right now, like I mentioned, are really focused on that cinematic quality, realism. Like, we want you to believe that this is a movie, that these are actors. And in some cases, they're literally just using motion capture to capture these actors. And that has grown increasingly sophisticated, and it's fun to marvel at it, but sometimes that's where everything stops. And the story is where I feel a lot of indie titles shine because they tend to write what they know. They tend to focus on things that they're passionate about. So like the game Balatro is one guy and a couple of like musical engineers. And I didn't expect to like that game at all because I'm not into like poker or gambling. I enjoyed, I literally lost so much time in the game Red Dead Redemption just playing blackjack. But outside of that, I've never really been into gambling or anything adjacent to it. But once I got into it, I was like, oh, this is not a gambling game. And I totally get the appeal, especially with the roguelike elements that I enjoy from other titles. And for me, that's something that I feel only indie could have come up with because it almost feels like the bigger the company gets, those types of ideas and that scale don't get as much focus or money. They're thinking about IPs that they can rebuild over and over again over years at a time. But an indie developer is usually only concerned with like crafting a singular experience. And I love that. It's very personal and unique, but regardless, people just relate to it. And I think that's pretty magical.
How much does the setting or the story or the characters themselves, how much is it important for you?
I'm pretty open-ended. I don't think that matters too much. And there have been games that have frankly surprised me, like games that were written with people specifically like me in mind. Like, I'll give you an example. A friend gifted me the game Forspoken. It features a Black female protagonist from New York City who gets thrown into this world that is like medieval-esque. And the game was cool, but there were a lot of gameplay loops that felt really stale within like 40 minutes of gameplay. It's like, yeah, I like the character, but I don't know why she has such a chip on her shoulder. So it's like, it matters, but it doesn't matter. And then the gauntlet that spoke to her was pretty grating after a while. It's like too quippy. Those are hallmarks of AAA games. And I was just like, actually, no, I didn't have the most fun with that, even though I expected to. I really loved the environments in the game. I loved the character's design, and I could relate to how she saw the world, but it just felt inauthentic in a lot of ways. Part of it, I think, was a culture clash. I did not expect Square Enix to come up with a game like that at all. And so I'm happy they experimented with it, and it's definitely a title I want to revisit at some point, but it's definitely not one that I would explore to 100% completion, because that's an art form in and of itself, is designing collectible games that are fun to play.
You mentioned you took a stab at designing and creating games yourself in game jams. What sort of games were you working on?
The first game that I built at a game jam, I went to the Global Game Jam in, I actually don't remember what year, but it's a while ago now. It's still on one of my friends' websites. It was a game about feelings. I was going through a pretty silly breakup at the time, and I wanted to get that energy out. And my friends were like, cool, we can do whatever we want. What else do you have? So instead of taking the art role that I thought it would take in this game as a designer, I ended up doing more of a production, almost directorial kind of approach to it. It was really interesting to get that game out and have other people play it. It was called, wow, I'm blanking on the name. It was centered around the 5 stages of grief. And one of the most validating experiences was pushing that out with friends, having people play it in cabinets at local venues in New York City. And years later, the game Gris came out, which was similarly about the 5 stages of grief. And I was just like, oh my God, if I had the skills, I could make a game like this. And I had the bud of the idea. And this game took it and like expanded it into this beautiful, picturesque, very emotive, almost art game. And that was really exciting to see that the tiniest seed of a personal experience was A, so relatable, and B, absolutely could become a bigger game than I thought it was. There are other games that were much, much smaller in scope, I think. Like we had a game that was like kind of an old school arcade game where you had to avoid spikes while you're this little guy holding onto a balloon. And sometimes that's the kind of game I want to play. So I wish more people made games like that, just like short things. And I see that on sites like Newgrounds and Itch.io that are somehow still around. I definitely want to get back into that hobby at some point, just for the fun of creating it. I don't plan on monetizing it or anything like that.
Usually when someone learns a new craft or learns to do something new, there's that, I wouldn't say shock, but there's that realization that, oh, the thing that I had in my head, it's a lot more difficult to put it out in reality. Did that happen for you?
Oh, absolutely. There were definitely elements of even just the game I talked about where it was just like, this is way too big of a scope, because we had 48 hours to get something together, really less than that. I was like, all right, so we'll cut this out. We'll cut this out. That helped us make it, frankly, a better game because we had to generalize some things. And that made it more accessible, I think, for others to handle. But I also realized like the fun of incorporating others to get other parts of the game done. I was really struggling with trying to come up with artwork for the game. It was a new medium for me. So one of my partners on the project took that part over. And then we had a person who did the music, and then coding the game was a shared responsibility across multiple people. Being able to sit in that leadership role in a way that I frankly wasn't after was really fun. And it made me reckon with those limitations of, oh, I'm not even sure how I would even begin to do that. So that rescoping really helps set some really helpful creative boundaries that I think is necessary in all creative work.
You mentioned the A word earlier, art. There's been a lot of conversation. Are video games art? Yes, no. Let's assume for our conversation that they are. But probably not every game necessarily falls into the category of art. What makes a game a work of art for you?
I think that is a really interesting question, because I think about, in general, what makes anything art, especially nowadays when we have machines being used to create art. And for me, it's a tricky question, especially with the advent of like Midjourney and other platforms like it. And I think games are unique in that the art can be something you can passively experience, But in some games, it's also something that you're almost collaborating with the game designer with, even though they're not in the room. In the same way you might read a book and have like a conversation with an author internally, they're not present, but you're co-creating something together. And there are some games where this is literal. But I think art in general is just something that we can experience. It's kind of interesting because that means every piece of software is art. And I think I'm being deliberately liberal in that definition because I think so much of the debate around what is art nowadays is constrained by who makes it and what makes it. And I don't necessarily care about that. I was really touched to see an elephant could paint itself. And I'm really touched to see how quickly a child can pick up any writing implement and just go to town. So I think art is really just expression at the end of the day.
Do you have a distinction of art within indie games versus AAA games? Do you think one or the other is more prone to being a work of art?
Absolutely. And I think indie games definitely do that better, in part because they're so individualized. I think indies doesn't set out to produce a certain experience the same way that AAA might. AAA, I don't want to call it soulless because there's definitely artful moments in AAA titles. Like the story of Halo, for example, will always stick with me. It's a very emotional story. And that for me is very artful. But as the series has gone on in years, it's felt less artful, frankly. They've kind of lost the plot quite literally. And indie being so small in scope, I think, lends itself to feel more like art because it's so personal, because it tends to be more universal, I think, because of that specificity. It's kind of the conundrum of art in general is like, if you make something for everyone, they kind of isn't for anyone. Whereas what makes indie special to me is that it tends to be very specialized, very specific to the individual creator. And I love that about it.
Do you ever find yourself sort of yearning for those early days of playing video games with your parents and the feeling that you had playing those games?
All the time, especially now where I play mostly on PC these days. And I have a variety of devices to help me get away from the PC because it's not really designed first and foremost for play. But yeah, I miss those days all the time because of back then, my only responsibility was to show up and play and learn things, no matter what medium or tool I was using. And I still feel a strong responsibility to that, but everything else gets in the way. And so I've made a huge point of finding places to carve out time to feel like that childlike wonder. And I think games work really well to do that because it's almost like walking through a simulation of someone else's dream. And I love that. It's like, I don't know what this person thinks like or feels like. And I'd actually love to see more games like that help us explore that kind of realm. I absolutely miss those days, but that's why I've held on to my older devices, why I'm rebuilding my retro library, and why I try to share it with others online.
We talked about a feeling of fun, but have there been games that created for you negative emotions, negative feelings?
Absolutely. And I'm laughing because in most cases, it wasn't the game alone that evoked those emotions, but the community around it. So there are certain games that I absolutely will not even think about because of that. So, for example, I will not play League of Legends. It is notorious for having a very toxic community around it. And for a while, Overwatch is on that list for other reasons, but there was a recent release of Marvel Rivals. And frankly, I assumed it would have a similar community. It does. And I assumed that I would not be into it because the community definitely has its share of just really nasty people who cannot take a loss, cannot hear a female voice without freaking out. And so I don't talk in this game, but I've actually really enjoyed it because I am a Marvel super fan. And that it has been enough to like keep me going. Although traditionally I've been like, if this game does not have an endpoint, I won't play it because I like to, experience things. But I think the lore connected to something I already love is like a loophole. So I've been enjoying that. But as far as like gameplay, there have definitely been times where I got stuck in almost like a negative cycle where I was trying to collect achievements more than I was playing the game. And since Xbox has kind of fallen by the wayside, it's gotten easier to put that away and just enjoy the game for the game's sake, especially since most people don't really care about those things anymore. There's no leaderboard. It's just you're on Steam, you have this achievement. It might reveal something to you that the developer has hidden. I think those are the best types of achievements, but I don't focus on getting that very rare achievement that no one else has anymore. I just want to play the game. So, yeah.
There are a lot of people who, for whatever reason, do not play video games or think it's not for them anymore, right? Maybe they played it as a child. What are some games that you would recommend people try out to sort of show them what is the potential of video games?
Ironically, a lot of the games that were out during the pandemic fit the bill really well for me. At the time, Animal Crossing was really popular, and I saw a lot of people who don't typically play games hop on, and I haven't seen them online since, but I think they understand through that experience what the appeal was of being able to interact with your friends digitally, especially in a context where it wasn't safe to do it otherwise. So those were some memories that I will always cherish, even though they were not under the best circumstances. That's a title. I really love the Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom, and Breath of the Wild series because it has a little bit of everything. It doesn't really explicitly tell you which way to go, which for some people that might be frustrating. I've certainly heard that commentary before. But I think it helps because it's also an older franchise. It helps people understand like how far this industry has come. And it really captures all the things I love about games as far as like story and emotion and just the exploration. Like you could really get lost in that game, even though there's literally a wall there. It looks like an ocean. It's a lot of fun. There's not a lot of constraints, but it manages to do a lot in as little or as much time as you want.
Awesome. Really sorry to cut this conversation too short, I feel. But Asia, where can people find you?
You can find me on Blue Sky. I happen to have 2 accounts there. There's one that's my design account, which is asia.bsky.social. And then the second one is Genesis, which is my gamer tag. But I'll make sure those are linked so in both directions. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Anytime.
This is all for this episode of Design Downtime. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, I hope you enjoy your downtime.